Good evening, gentle listener, and welcome back to Evelina. This is going to be a very exciting episode as Evelina finally goes to London, meets some people, and attends her first ball. Can you imagine the excitement for a young girl from the country to attend her first ball? It will be just as wonderful as you could desire from any period drama. Let me tell you, there is no ball more awkward than the ball in Evelina. Trust me, the Meryton Assembly has nothing on this. And thus I begin. Letter the 10th. Evelina to the Reverend Mr. Villas, Queen Anne Street, London, Saturday, 2nd April. This moment arrived, just going to Drury Lane Theatre. The celebrated Mr. Garrick performs Ranger. I am quite in ecstasy. So is Miss Mervyn. How fortunate that he should happen to play. We would not let Mrs. Mervyn rest till she consented to go. Her chief objection was to our dress, for we have had no time to Londonize ourselves. But we teased her into compliance, and so we are to sit in some obscure place that she may not be seen. As to me, I shall be alike unknown in the most conspicuous or most private part of the house. I can write no more now. I hardly have time to breathe. Only just this. The houses and streets are not quite so superb as I expected. However, I have seen nothing yet, so I ought not to judge. Well, adieu, my dearest sir, for the present. I could not forbear writing a few words instantly upon my arrival, though I suppose my letter of thanks for your consent is still on the road. Saturday night. Oh, my dear sir, in what raptures am I returned! Well may Mr. Garrick be so celebrated, so universally admired. I had not any idea of so great a performer. Such ease, such vivacity in his manner, such grace in his motions, such fire and meaning in his eyes. I could hardly believe he had studied a written part, for every word seemed to be uttered from the impulse of the moment. His action, at once so grateful and so free, his voice, so clear, so melodious, yet so wonderfully various in its tones, such animation, every look speaks. I would have given the world to have had the whole play acted over again. And when he danced, oh, how I envied Clorinda! I almost wished to have jumped on the stage and joined them. I am afraid you will think me mad, so I won't say any more. Yet I really believe Mr. Garrick would make you mad too, if you could see him. I intend to ask Mrs. Mervyn to go to the play every night while we stay in town. She is extremely kind to me. And Maria, her charming daughter, is the sweetest girl in the world. I shall write to you every evening all that passes in the day, and that in the same manner as if I could see you, I should tell you. Sunday. This morning we went to Portland Chapel, and afterwards we walked in the Mall of St. James's Park, which by no means answered my expectations. It is a long straight walk, of dirty gravel, very uneasy to the feet, and at each end, instead of an open prospect, nothing is to be seen but houses built of brick. When Mrs. Mervyn pointed out the palace to me, I think I was never much more surprised. However, the walk was very agreeable to us. Everybody looked gay and seemed pleased, and the ladies were so much dressed that Miss Mervyn and I could do nothing but look at them. Mrs. Mervyn met several of her friends. No wonder, for I never saw so many people assembled together before. I looked about for some of my acquaintance, but in vain, for I saw not one person that I knew, which is very odd, for all the world seemed there. Mrs. Mervyn says we are not to walk in the park again next Sunday, even if we should be in town, because there is better company in Kensington Gardens. But really, if you had seen how much everybody was dressed, you would not think that possible. Monday. We are to go this evening to a private ball, given by Mrs. Stanley, a very fashionable lady of Mrs. Mervyn's acquaintance. We have been a-shopping, as Mrs. Mervyn calls it, all this morning to buy silks, caps, gauzes, and so forth. The shops are really very entertaining, especially the mercers. There seem to be 6 or 7 men belonging to each shop, and every one took care, by bowing and smirking, to be noticed. We were conducted from one to another, and carried from room to room with so much ceremony that at first I was almost afraid to go on. I thought I should never have chosen a silk, for they produced so many I knew not which to fix upon, and they recommended them all so strongly that I fancy they thought I only wanted persuasion to buy everything they showed me, and indeed they took so much trouble that I was almost ashamed I could not. At the milliner's, the ladies we met were so much dressed that I should have rather imagined they were making visits than purchases. But what most delighted me was that we were more frequently served by men than by women. And such men! So finical, so affected. They seem to understand every part of a woman's dress better than we do ourselves. And they recommended caps and ribbons with an air of so much importance that I wished to ask them how long they had left off wearing them. The dispatch with which they work in these great shops is amazing, for they have promised me a complete suit of linen against the evening. I have just had my hair dressed. You can't think how oddly my head feels, full of powder and black pins and a great cushion on top of it. I believe you would hardly know me, for my face looks quite different to what it did before my hair was dressed. When I shall be able to make use of a comb for myself, I cannot tell, for my hair is so much entangled, frizzled, they call it, that I fear it will be very difficult. I am half afraid of this ball tonight, for you know I have never danced but at school. However, Miss Mervyn says there is nothing in it. Yet I wish it were over. Adieu, my dear sir. Pray excuse the wretched stuff I write. Perhaps I may improve by being in this town, and then my letters will be less unworthy your reading. Meantime, I am your dutiful and affectionate, though unpolished, Evelina. Poor Miss Mervyn cannot wear one of the caps she made, because they dress her hair too large for them. Letter the 11th. Evelina in continuation. Queen Anne Street, 5th of April, Tuesday morning. I have a vast deal to say, and shall give all this morning to my pen. As to my plan of writing every evening the adventures of the day, I find it impracticable, for the diversions here are so very late that if I begin my letters after them, I could not go to bed at all. We passed a most extraordinary evening. A private ball, this was called, so I expected to have seen about 4 or 5 couple. But Lord, my dear sir, I believe I saw half the world. 2 very large rooms were full of company. In one were cards for the elderly ladies, and in the other were the dancers. My mamma Mervyn, for she always calls me her child, said she would sit with Maria and me till we were provided with partners, and then join the card players. The gentlemen, as they passed and repassed, looked as if they thought we were quite at their disposal, and only waiting for the honour of their commands, and they sauntered about in a careless, indolent manner, as if with a view to keep us in suspense. I don't speak of this in regard to Miss Mervyn and myself only, but to the ladies in general, and I thought it so provoking that I determined in my own mind that, far from humouring such airs, I would rather not dance at all, than with anyone who would seem to think me ready to accept the first partner who would condescend to take me. Not long after, a young man, who had for some time looked at us with a kind of negligent impertinence, advanced on tiptoes towards me. He had a set smile on his face, and his dress was so foppish that I really believe he wished to be stared at, and yet he was very ugly. Bowing almost to the ground, with a sort of swing, and waving his hands with the greatest conceit, after a short and silly pause, he said, "Madam, may I presume?" and stopped, offering to take my hand. I drew it back, but could scarce forbear laughing. "Allow me, madam," continued he, affectedly breaking off every half moment, "the honour and happiness, if I am not so unhappy as to address you too late, to have the happiness and honour—" Again he would have taken my hand, but bowing my head, I begged to be excused, and turned to Miss Mervyn to conceal my laughter. He then desired to know if I had already engaged myself to some more fortunate man. I said no, and that I believed I should not dance at all. He would keep himself, he told me, disengaged, in hopes I should relent, and then, uttering some ridiculous speeches of sorrow and disappointment, though his face still wore the same inevitable smile, he retreated. It so happened, as we have since recollected, that during this little dialogue, Mrs. Mervyn was conversing with the lady of the house, and very soon another gentleman, who seemed about 26 years old, gaily but not foppishly dressed, and indeed extremely handsome, with an air of mixed politeness and gallantry, desired to know if I was engaged, or would honour him with my hand. So, as he was pleased to say, though I am sure I know not what honour he could receive from me, that these sort of expressions, I find, are used as words of course, without any distinction of persons or study of propriety. Well, I bowed, and I am sure I coloured, for indeed I was frightened at the thoughts of dancing before so many people, all strangers, and which was worse, with a stranger. However, that was unavoidable, for though I looked round the room several times, I could not see one person that I knew. And so he took my hand and led me to join the dance. The minuets were over before we arrived, for we were kept late by the milliners making us wait for our things. He seemed very desirous of entering into conversation with me, but I was seized with such a panic that I could hardly speak a word, and nothing but the shame of so soon changing my mind prevented me returning to my seat and declining to dance at all. He appeared to be surprised at my terror, which I believe was but too apparent. However, he asked no questions, though I fear he must think it very strange, for I did not choose to tell him that it was owing to my never before dancing but with a schoolgirl. His conversation was sensible and spirited. His air and address were open and noble, his manners gentle, attentive, and infinitely engaging. His person is all elegance, and his countenance the most animated and expressive I have ever seen. In a short time we were joined by Miss Mervyn, who stood next couple to us. But how was I startled when she whispered me that my partner was a nobleman! This gave me a new alarm. How will he be provoked, thought I, when he finds what a simple rustic he has honoured with his choice, one whose ignorance of the world makes her perpetually fear doing something wrong. That he should be so much my superior in every way quite disconcerted me. And you will suppose my spirits were not much raised when I heard a lady in passing say, "This is the most difficult dance I ever did see." "Oh dear then," cried Maria to her partner, "with your leave, I'll sit down till the next." "So will I too then," cried I, "for I am sure I can hardly stand." "But you must speak to your partner first," answered she, for he had turned aside to talk with some gentleman. However, I had not sufficient courage to address him, and so away all three tripped, and seated ourselves at another end of the room. But unfortunately for me, Miss Mervyn soon after suffered herself to be prevailed upon to attempt the dance, and just as she rose to go, she cried, "My dear, yonder is your partner, Lord Orville, walking about the room in search of you." "Don't leave me then, dear girl," cried I, but she was obliged to go, and now I was more uneasy than ever. I would have given the world to have seen Mrs. Mervyn, and begged of her to make my apologies. For what, thought I, can I possibly say to him in excuse for running away? He must either conclude me a fool or half mad, for any one brought up in the great world and accustomed to its ways can have no idea of such sort of fears as mine. My confusion increased when I observed that he was everywhere seeking me, with apparent perplexity and surprise. But when at last I saw him move towards the place where I sat, I was ready to sink from shame and distress. I found it absolutely impossible to keep my seat, because I could not think of a word to say for myself. So I rose and walked hastily towards the card-room, resolving to stay with Mrs. Mervyn the rest of the evening and not to dance at all. But before I could find her, Lord Orville saw and approached me. He begged to know if I was not well. You may easily imagine how much I was embarrassed. I made no answer, but hung my head like a fool, and looked on my fan. He then, with an air the most respectfully serious, asked if he had been so unhappy as to offend me. "No, indeed," cried I, and in hopes of changing the discourse and preventing his further inquiries, I desired to know if he had seen the young lady who had been conversing with me. "No, but would I honour him with any commands to her?" "Oh, by no means." "Was there any other person with whom I wished to speak?" I said, "No," before I knew I had answered at all. Should he have the pleasure of bringing me any refreshment? I bowed, almost involuntarily, and away he flew. I was quite ashamed of myself of being so troublesome, and so much above myself, as these seeming airs made me appear. But indeed I was too much confused to think or act with any consistency. If he had not been swift as lightning, I don't know whether I should not have stolen away again. But he returned in a moment. When I had drunk a glass of lemonade, he hoped, he said, that I would again honour him with my hand as a new dance was just begun. I had not the presence of mind to say a single word, and so I let him once more lead me to the place I had left. Shocked to find how silly, how childish a part I had acted, my former fears of dancing before such a company and with such a partner returned more forcibly than ever. I suppose he perceived my uneasiness, for he entreated me to sit down again, if dancing was disagreeable to me. But I was quite satisfied with the folly I had already shown, and therefore declined his offer, though I was really scarce able to stand. Under such conscious disadvantages, you may easily imagine, my dear sir, how ill I acquitted myself. But though I had both expected and deserved to find him very much mortified and displeased at his ill fortune in the choice he had made, yet to my very great relief he appeared to be even contented, and very much assisted and encouraged me. These people in high life have too much presence of mind, I believe, to seem disconcerted or out of humour, however they may feel. For had I been the person of the most consequence in the room, I could not have met with more attention and respect. When the dance was over, seeing me still very much flurried, he led me to a seat, saying that he would not suffer me to fatigue myself from politeness. And then, if my capacity, or even if my spirits had been better, in how animated a conversation might I have been engaged? It was then I saw that the rank of Lord Orville was his least recommendation, his understanding and his manners being far more distinguished. His remarks upon the company in general were so apt, so just, so lively. I am almost surprised myself that they did not reanimate me. But indeed I was too well convinced of the ridiculous part I had myself played before so nice an observer, to be able to enjoy his pleasantry. So self-compassion gave me feeling for others. Yet I had not the courage to attempt either to defend them or to rally in my turn, but listened to him in silent embarrassment. When he found this, he changed the subject and talked of public places and public performers, but he soon discovered that I was totally ignorant of them. He then very ingeniously turned the discourse to the amusements and occupations of the country. It now struck me that he was resolved to try whether or not I was capable of talking upon any subject. This put so great a constraint upon my thoughts that I was unable to go further than a monosyllable, and not even so far, when I could possibly avoid it. We were sitting in this manner, he conversing with all gaiety, I looking down with all foolishness, when that fop who had first asked me to dance with the most ridiculous solemnity approached, and after a profound bow or two said, "I humbly beg pardon, madam, and of you too, my lord, for breaking in upon such agreeable conversation, which must, doubtless, be much more delectable than what I have the honour to offer, but—" I interrupted him. I blushed for my folly with laughing. Yet I could not help it, for added to the man's stately foppishness, and he actually took snuff between every 3 words. When I looked round at Lord Orville, I saw such extreme surprise in his face, the cause of which appeared so absurd that I could not for my life preserve my gravity. I had not laughed before from the time I had left Miss Mervyn, and I had much better have cried then. Lord Orville actually stared at me. The beau, I know not his name, looked quite enraged. "Refrain, madam," said he, with an important air. "A few moments, refrain. I have but a sentence to trouble you with. May I know to what accident I must attribute not having the honour of your hand?" "Accident, sir?" repeated I, much astonished. "Yes, accident, madam. For surely I must take the liberty to observe, pardon me, madam, it ought to be no common one, that could tempt a lady, so young a one too, to be guilty of ill manners." A confused idea now for the first time entered my head, of something I had heard of the rules of an assembly. But I was never at one before. I've only danced at school, and so giddy and heedless I was, that I had not once considered the impropriety of refusing one partner, and afterwards accepting another. I was thunderstruck at the recollection, but while these thoughts were rushing into my head, Lord Orville, with some warmth, said, "This lady, sir, is incapable of meriting such an accusation." The creature, for I am very angry with him, made a low bow, and with a grin the most malicious I ever saw, said, "My lord, far be it from me to accuse the lady for having the discernment to distinguish and prefer the superior attractions of your lordship." Again he bowed and walked off. Was ever anything so provoking? I was ready to die with shame. "What a coxcomb!" exclaimed Lord Orville, while I, without knowing what I did, rose hastily, moving off. "I can't imagine," cried I, "where Mrs. Mervyn has hid herself." "Give me leave to see," answered he. I bowed and sat down again, not daring to meet his eyes, for what must he think of me, between my blunder and the supposed preference? He returned in a moment, and told me that Mrs. Mervyn was at cards, but would be glad to see me. And I went immediately. There was but one chair vacant, so to my great relief Lord Orville presently left us. I then told Mrs. Mervyn my disasters, and she good-naturedly blamed herself for not having better instructed me, but said she had taken it for granted that I must know such common customs. However, the man may, I think, be satisfied with his pretty speech and carry his resentment no further. In a short time Lord Orville returned. I consented with the best grace I could to go down another dance, for I had had time to recollect myself, and therefore resolved to use some exertion, and, if possible, appear less a fool than I had hitherto done. For it occurred to me that, insignificant as I was compared to a man of his rank and figure, yet since he had been so unfortunate as to make choice of me for a partner, why, I should endeavour to make the best of it. The dance, however, was short, and he spoke very little, so I had no opportunity of putting my resolution in practice. He was satisfied, I suppose, with his former successless efforts to draw me out, or rather I fancied he had been inquiring who I was. This again disconcerted me, and the spirits I had determined to exert again failed me. Tired, ashamed, and mortified, I begged to sit down till we returned home, which I did soon after. Lord Orville did me the honour to hand me to the coach, talking all the way of the honour I had done him. Oh, these fashionable people! Well, my dear sir, was it not a strange evening? I could not help being thus particular, because to me everything is so new. But it is now time to conclude. I am, with all love and duty, your Evelina. Well, quite an episode, gentle reader, do you not think? And quite a uncertain start to London society for poor Miss Anville. Well, shall we meet the fop again? Shall we see the lovely Lord Orville again? Tune in tomorrow for the next instalment.